Buonasera a tutti, ringrazio gli spettatori che oggi sono qui a sentire questa conferenza di Daphne Grace. Daphne Grace è una professoressa di storia della letteratura inglese presso l'Università di Brighton in Inghilterra, ha insegnato anche all'Università di Bahamas ed è esperta proprio di Mary Shelley e Percy Shelley. Per cui lasciamo subito la parola a lei per parlarci di questo argomento. Grazie.
Grazie. Grazie. I'm going to speak in English and then the whole talk will be translated into Italian. So tonight we're talking about Percy Shelley, poet of both romance and revolution. And this year famously marks the bicentenary of Shelley's death. Obviously 200 years ago on July the 8th, when his boat that he was sailing in the Gulf of Spezia went down in a very sudden summer storm, and he and the other 3 men on board the ship were lost. This year, obviously at this time in July, we're celebrating his life and his work with conferences and different events in England, but also especially in Italy, in Rome, and here in Sorrento. So he was drowned, and then his body was actually lost for 10 days at sea. Eventually it was famously washed up on the beach in Viareggio, and it was actually unrecognizable after being in the sea for so long. But inside the pocket of his jacket there was a copy of Keats's poems, and they realized when they found this volume of poems that the body belonged to Shelley. And he was equally famous at the time of his death for being a poet, a philosopher, but also an adulterer, an advocate of free love, and he was also an ardent feminist, which was quite unusual at that time. Not to mention also a very dangerous anarchist and an atheist who had been expelled from Oxford University when he was a student. So there's much more to Shelley than just this list would suggest. He was a man of tremendous energy, idealism, intellectual power, a man who cared little for the rules or the opinions of other people. He made up his own morality and his own spirituality. He even rebelled, and I like to think, if we think of the paintings of Shelley, he even rebelled in the way he dressed, because at the time it was very high collars that the men wore, very starched black cravats, and he always is pictured with his shirt open as if he really wanted to breathe without all the restrictions of the contemporary fashion. So he, along with this, he rejected his family origins, his class, and famously died in exile. When he died, one national newspaper wrote, "Shelley, the writer of some infidel poetry, has been drowned. Now he knows whether or no there is a God." But what else do we know about Shelley? He was a strict vegetarian and equally was devoted to shooting guns, going on mountain walks, reading and studying and learning. And he, like his second wife, Mary, was a passionate inquirer into the contemporary discoveries in science at that time, particularly the new discoveries in electricity and the circulation of the blood. Moreover, his idealistic philosophy and morality was the basis for his lifelong protest against the evils of many facets of life, including organized religion, marriage, and he also was vehemently against eating any forms of meat or killing animals. He was also plagued by visions and dreams, and one of the finest lyric poets in the English language. He's still regarded as one of the most powerful and influential thinkers of his day. and his ideas are still very relevant, as we will see. So although he was only 29 years old when he died, he was to leave a very big legacy of an intellect and poems that married mysticism with social conscience. And in fact, if we get a book of the collected works of Shelley, the complete works of Shelley, it's a very long book. It makes me think just how much he wrote and how much he actually achieved by the age of 29. Of all the Romantic poets, he's the most professional, perhaps, in his outlook to writing, the most scholarly, and he's the most accomplished in terms of artistry. So he read 10 languages, he translated works from Italian, Greek, German, Spanish, Latin, and even taught himself Arabic, so that he could translate original works from Arabic. He wrote for the intellectual as well as for the common man, and he very much admired Wordsworth's demand, really, that the language of poetry should be the language of ordinary men. From the start, he was also a writer who was passionately interested in philosophy and political ideas, as well as aesthetics. And like his great friend Lord Byron, he was to become passionately involved in the cause of Italian independence. His biographer, Richard Hughes, argues that, quote, Shelley has become an increasingly European figure, a Dante amongst English poets, and an image of Faustian daring whose writing and travels still inspire that primary spirit of adventure into a wide world of ideal possibilities. Indeed, many of Shelley's poems are informed by Dante, and his later work, The Triumph of Life, is directly inspired by the Divine Comedy, both in terms of content and style. As a poet and revolutionary thinker, Shelley believed art can be a political inspiration, and Shelley and Byron both believed that there was really no difference at all between poetry and politics. They were one and the same thing. So for many scholars today, Shelley is actually primarily a revolutionary and then a poet. So several conferences are on Shelley the revolutionary. What was he doing? What was he arguing? What was he fighting for? Oh, and by the way, what's he writing in terms of poetry? Shelley's radical ideas have been adopted by many through the years who are fighting for a more equal society. His works have been read by and have inspired countless thinkers and world changers. Engels and Marx, Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi in India, and the Pankhursts and the suffragettes in Britain. And his legacy amongst revolutionaries is something we'll continue to talk about a little bit later. But where was he born? What was the early years of Shelley's life? He's famous as one of the 5 great Romantic poets, the others being Coleridge and Wordsworth, who were the first generation, and then Shelley, Keats, and Byron, who were slightly younger. Often, Keats and Shelley are put together very often. We have the Keats-Shelley Institute in Rome, we have the Keats-Shelley House on the Piazza di Spagna. But it's much more likely, really, a much better combination would be to put Shelley and Byron together because they were friends. Keats was always a little bit wary of Shelley. Keats was working class, Shelley was an aristocrat, and they didn't actually, although Shelley and Keats did meet, they didn't actually get on that well together, although both admired each other's poetry. And in fact, Shelley, when they was living in Pisa with his family, he invited Keats to come and stay with them in Pisa. But of course, famously, Keats didn't make it because he had already died on the way in Rome. Also, another similarity between Byron and Shelley is that As I mentioned, Shelley and Byron were both passionately involved in the cause of Italian independence. And in fact, many believe that Byron's interest in the cause of Greek independence, which of course eventually he went to fight for, was due to Shelley's influence. And indeed, once he was in Greece, Byron remarked that this should have been Shelley. And they, of course, had their differences. Shelley was more of a mystic. Byron was much more of a cynic and a satirist. But both wanted to sort of stir up society. Shelley, unlike Byron, was very much in touch with the working class. He very anti-establishment, anti-aristocratic, and he opposed all forms of the established bodies in society, especially the church and religion. Byron was to write about Shelley saying, "As to poor Shelley, he is to my knowledge the least selfish and the mildest of men. A man who has made more sacrifices of his fortune and feelings for others than any I have heard of. With his speculative opinions, I have nothing in common, nor desire to have." So in fact, the Romantic poets never actually saw themselves as a movement. They were sort of kindred spirits, very often critics of each other, but they were all reacting to the wave of new ideas in Europe. And those ideas, of course, originated in the French Revolution, and the ideas of, liberty, equality, fraternity, really they took to heart, and that they were the building blocks really of what they believed in. At the same time, the Romantics obviously rejected organised religion, particularly Coleridge, and challenged Christianity in favour of a more transcendental spirituality that centralised man as the core of religion rather than God. So Shelley the man was born 1792, very significantly the year that Thomas Paine wrote The Rights of Man. And it was also the year that France declared war on Britain, and so it was the start until 1815 of the wars against Napoleon. Shelley was the son of an aristocrat and a politician, and he was born in a very grand house in the town of Horsham in Sussex, which is one of the most beautiful rural counties in England. And as a young boy, he went to the best schools, and he was expected to go into politics like his father. He was expected then to inherit his father's title of baronet, like his father Sir Timothy before him. But of course, neither of these were to happen, because obviously Shelley actually died before his father. He was generous as a young man, intelligent, inquiring mind, and absolutely passionate about both gaining knowledge and helping other people. He went to study at Oxford University, but he didn't stay very long as a student. With his friend T.J. Hogg, he wrote what was to become an infamous text called The Necessity of Atheism, which was a pamphlet that questioned the existence of God and came to the conclusion that there is no proof and therefore God does not exist. Refusing, when he was called by the authorities and questioned, he refused to either admit or deny that he had written the text, and so he was promptly expelled from Oxford, and copies of the pamphlet were burnt in bookshops. So he left the university in disgrace, and obviously his future career was absolutely finished. He could never become a politician. He would never really amount to very much. But he had plans and continued his own sort of self-study of philosophy that he enjoyed, and he was also very much in love. So when he was only 17 and the young lady was 16, he ran away to Scotland to marry a young lady, Harriet Westbrook. But the most important relationship that he used to form at the time was with the man who became his new teacher and mentor, the philosopher William Godwin. Godwin, together with his first wife, Mary Wollstonecraft, were to remain the chief influences in Shelley's own life and philosophy. Godwin invited Shelley as a student to come to his home to discuss their mutual ideas, philosophy, and it was there that Shelley met William Godwin's daughter, Mary, who was prodigiously intelligent and obviously, famously, Shelley, even though his first wife Harriet at this point had 2 young children and was pregnant with a third child, Shelley left her to run away with Mary to France. So after their idyllic escape to France together, after 6 weeks their money ran out and they had to come back to England, and they stayed in London in a few different places, always moving where they lived, so that the debtors they owed money to could never actually find them. They just kept moving to escape paying the money they owed. So eventually they realised it's much cheaper to live in Europe. And so they left England together, and they famously met Lord Byron and his doctor, Dr. Polidori, on Lake Geneva for the summer of 1816, where Mary, who was already calling herself Mrs. Shelley, although they were not to marry for a couple of years yet, because Shelley was still married, it was there that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. And then later that year, the Shelleys moved south to Italy, mainly living in Pisa and on the Tuscan coast at Bagni di Lucca. And although Shelley didn't know at the time, he would never go back to England. So from then on, really, he was in exile in Italy. Once they were married in 1818, Percy and Mary Shelley lived in Italy for the 8 years, about 6 years that they were actually married. It was a very difficult time. They didn't have an easy marriage by any means, especially for Mary, who was plagued by heartache. They had several children who all died. And the other thing that was very difficult being married to Shelley was that he was, should we say, a passionate admirer of women and didn't believe in marriage as an institution, so that left him free to pursue lots of different affairs. But they worked together, they wrote together, they studied together, they both edited each other's work. Mary would comment and edit his poetry. Very famously, Percy Shelley also commented and edited Frankenstein. For Shelley, the visit to Italy really inspired all his major works, including his long historical play, the Cenci, and other poems such as Ode to the West Wind, Ode to the Skylark, Cloud, etc. So he was a prolific writer, and as we've already mentioned, once he came to Italy, he also got caught up in the whole enthusiasm of Italian politics, including the July 1920 revolution, which saw the Carbonari and the Army of Neapolitan Freedom demanding a constitution from the Bourbon monarchs. Many other poets from England would follow in the footsteps of Byron and Shelley and become involved in the Italian Risorgimento. But although Shelley, one of his great hobbies was firing guns, it seems he never actually became an active member of the Carbonari, unlike Lord Byron, who became a signed-up member of the Carbonari in Ravenna. But they were very sympathetic to the aims, and he wrote, some of his poetry was involving a comparison between some of the political events in Italy, and particularly he remained politically engaged with what was happening in England. There was an event in England, when the army opened fire on peaceful protesters, which became known as Peterloo in Manchester. And Shelley wrote a very long poem called The Mask of Anarchy, which decries the use of government force against innocent civilians. So for extended periods, the Shelleys joined Byron in Pisa and Livorno, and they also, at different times, Shelley and Byron and Mary went to visit the famous Tasso prison in Ferrara. Arriving at the prison, Shelley managed to take a piece of wood from the door, so he was not a very good tourist, but he got his knife out and took a bit of Tasso's door away with him. But Lord Byron, when Byron went to see the prison where they had caged the mad Tasso, Byron was to write, I came by Ferrara, Tasso's cell, as well as the old castle. He wrote to a friend, they're very well worth your seeing, all the Jerusalem, and Tasso's correspondence about his dirty shirts are all displayed. So Byron is always the cynic and the iconoclast. But meanwhile, the Shelleys moved down to live in Naples, and obviously then it becomes more relevant to the experience in Sorrento. And I like to think that the Shelleys, like Byron, were Tasso tourists, and although we don't have any firm documentation that Byron came to Sorrento, I think he absolutely positively must have done. Percy and Mary arrived in the Bay of Naples in December 1818. They took lodgings at number 250 Riviera di Chiaia, opposite the Royal Gardens. Percy, in a letter of January 1819, writes, Naples is, I can easily conceive, to most people, a delightful residence. We live on the Chiaia, just opposite the Royal Gardens, so that we have a full view of the lovely bay and can hear the dashing of the waves on the sea. We've been to Vesuvius, Herculaneum, Pompeii, so that you may guess we've enjoyed ourselves here. From our windows, we perpetually see the blue waters of the bay, forever changing, yet forever the same. A visit to the city of the dead, obviously Pompeii, inspired Shelley's poem Ode to Naples, which begins with Shelley's marvellously evocative description of his visit to Pompeii. He writes, I stood within the city disinterred and heard the autumnal leaves like light footfalls of spirits passing through the streets, and heard the mountain's slumberous voice at intervals thrill through those roofless halls. Shelley calls Naples the metropolis of a ruined paradise, the centre of a ruined paradise, and vows that one day the city again shall be free. In Naples, inspired by culture and natural beauty, Percy Shelley composed a number of his major poems. The opening lines of his poems, stanza written in dejection near Naples, surely is one of Shelley's actually most miserable poems, but it bears witness to what he was experiencing at the time. It starts, alas, I have nor hope, nor health, nor peace, nor hope around, nor that content surpassing wealth. Most of what we know about her time in Naples actually comes from Mary's letters and her journal. So in a letter at that time, Mary comments that the constant physical suffering that Shelley was experiencing exhausted him and often greatly, although we enjoyed our wanderings in Naples and our excursions on its sunny sea, yet many hours passed when his thoughts, shadowed by illness, became gloomy, and then he escaped into solitude. However, soon Percy must have recovered somewhat. Mary's journal records they were walking in the gardens. During the day, she was copying out Shelley's poems. And we know that their intellectual life together was very rich and deeply shared. Sometimes, Mary writes, Shelley hid his poems from me for fear of wounding me. But they have a very active schedule. They make the very dramatic and quite dangerous ascent of Mount Vesuvio, although Mary's account of it is brief. She writes, go up Vesuvius and see the rivers of lava gush from its sides. We are very much fatigued, and S, Shelley, is very ill. They stayed on the mountain to watch the sunset, and then came down by torchlight. Shelley was taken ill, as she said, on the descent, and had to be helped down to the hermitage in order to rest and recover. With him complaining the whole time. They go to Paestum to see the Greek temples. On a rainy day, they set off, and they have to stay overnight in those days in Salerno. And in those days, also, Paestum was really quite a dangerous place, quite a new place to visit, because the ruins had only recently been cleared. And then they returned to Naples. And so it must have been during this time when they were traveling to Paestum, to Vesuvio, Herculaneum, and so on, that they came to Sorrento. And we know that they visited Sorrento. The only thing we don't know exactly is which hotel they stayed in. Both the Hotel Tramontano and the Villa Magna claim Shelley as resident in their hotels. And I think that although the guest books of the Tramontano have long been lost, I think it's probably most likely that they did stay at the Tramontano. Shelley, after all, was an aristocrat, was used to sort of very fine living, and although the Tramontano at the time was a very small hotel, it was nevertheless very well kept and had an excellent reputation. But unfortunately, all too soon, their stay in Naples came to a very spectacular end. And this is with the controversial event of a child's name being registered in the birth records for one of the churches in Naples. And who exactly this child was remains a mystery to this day. All we know is that Percy Shelley wrote his name as the father, and the little girl was given Shelley as her surname. But who was she? Was it the child of Claire, who was living with them as Mary Shelley's stepsister? Or some people have suggested it was an orphan from Naples that Shelley felt sorry for and adopted. And so we still have no idea who actually this little girl, who the mother was. But she was baptized Eleanor. And one of the reasons why this was such a big event in the Shelley household is that Mary knew nothing about it until the day after this child had been baptized and given the name Eleanor Shelley. And so there was a very big, Mary says it was a very big fuss, and they left Naples the next day to return to Rome in a very big hurry. So Shelley sent money to the people who were looking after this little girl, and he hoped that he wanted to Eleanor, the little girl, baby, to join him and Mary once they reached Rome. But unfortunately, when he sent the little girl, he was informed that she had already died. This news threw Shelley into a very deep depression, and we still don't know why he was so badly affected. Whatever the truth, he wrote that it was to add another memory to those which already torture me. And tragic as it wasn't actually the end of the matter. It was brought up again when they were in Pisa, when their manservant and maid decided to blackmail Shelley about this event. And eventually it was organised, it was fine. They had to sort of get rid of the blackmail threat through lawyers. And eventually it sort of died, the whole problem died down. But so they're back in Rome, back in Pisa, which they really made their main base. The events of Naples really were to haunt them the rest of the time they had in Italy. But just to move on a little bit to some of the poems, let's look at some of the poems and why their relevance has still lasted through the years. We're talking about Shelley both as a poet of romance and revolution. And so, how can these two extremes really be reconciled? A love poet and somebody who stirs up revolutions. Today, we actually find that Shelley's words are still painted on walls during revolutions. This is how contemporary he still is. From the Arab Spring revolutions to the freedom struggles in Northern Ireland, we still find his words being used to become slogans. Especially one of his poems called The Mask of Anarchy, which I've already mentioned. The opening lines, which are often quoted, it's actually the last stanza. Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. Very often, ye are many, they are few is changed to we are many, they are few. One of his most famous and the shortest poems, Ozymandias, summarizes Shelley's vision of the reality of tyranny and injustice. Both will fail. Resistance is everything. Strength lies in numbers. The few will always be vanquished by the many. And the famous line there that many people quote, many people know it as a line from poetry without knowing where it comes from. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So he clearly saw that both misery and evil were created by tyranny and exploitation by the ruling class. Life should be and can be changed. So he was anti-racist, anti-imperialist, an aristocrat who rejected his class and fought for the working classes. So by future generations, including our contemporary generation, he's claimed by the left as a socialist. He also argued that poets are the voice, the representative legislators of the people, and that's why poets are so dangerous. This, of course, is not a new idea. and one that we're very familiar with today, which is why when there are revolutions, it's usually the poets and the journalists and the writers who are the first to be put in jail. So these big themes, social inequality, injustice, tyranny, these are the huge topics of some of his poems and plays. But his most famous poems are metaphysical as well, pondering the eternal questions of the meaning of life and the place of mankind in the universe. One of the greatest lines in any poem ever, I feel, is life like a dome of many-coloured glass stains the white radiance of eternity, which is from Maione. But we can't overlook that Shelley was within the romantic tradition of romantic nature poems.